Well, joining me now, Marco Vicenzino is the director of the Global Strategy Project. Thank you very much for being with us. Now, there were a lot of disputes, a lot of arguments and rifts this week. Would you say this gathering did more harm than good when it comes to NATO unity?
Listen, when it comes to the substance of NATO, there's far more that unites the 29-member defense pact than divides them. But, however, it's important not to underestimate there are serious differences that range from funding, coordination, military priorities. There are differences. The problem is that these divisions and these differences often spill over into the personal realm, where you have acrimony, personal insults, and that's what tends to dominate headlines. And the good that's been achieved in this particular summit, in the 70th anniversary, often does not receive the attention that it deserves. For example, what was announced that didn't get much coverage was something that outer space becoming an operational domain for NATO. Now, in the short term, it may not appear to be much, but in the long term, it has enormous implications. There's issues also in terms of the funding. When I just mentioned, there's been a commitment by Turkey, the European Union, within the next few years to spend up to $400 billion on military defense budgets. So, and everyone slowly, even the Germans announced over time, they will increase it to the NATO mandated 2% of GDP. So the long term, what's been achieved is it's going to be gradual. It'll take time. It doesn't dominate headlines. It's not quick. But in terms of short term, you look, for example, and a very, very important fact is that Turkey did not block NATO's defense plans for Northern Europe and for Eastern Europe. You also have, in terms of the European, another important element would be the fact that you had the reaffirmation of the threats presented by Russia, and also by the rise of China. So, like I said, basically the bottom line is, yes, there are differences. Those differences are gaining headlines, but what unites the allies is far more outweighs it.
Right. Just to pick up on what you said about Turkey, and as you say, they did manage to get Recep Erdogan to back down over his threat to stop funding NATO unless they recognise the YPG Kurdish militia as terrorists. However, the fact remains that Erdogan has still been purchasing arms from Russia. That poses a huge problem for NATO, doesn't it?
In the build-up to this conferences, there were several developments. One was, you said, the purchase of the S-400 missiles. The other one was Turkish incursion into northern Syria. And also you had rhetorical statements made by President Macron talking about the brain death of NATO from a strategic perspective. These were all into the divisiveness was brewing towards the actual summit itself today. But the key thing is that although the differences exist, and it's what I said originally, it is important not to underestimate those divisions. Those divisions will keep lurking within the horizon for NATO. But the point I was making is that what unites them far outweighs the divisions, but it's important to keep in mind to bear these divisions and constantly try to manage them. And whether he may stay with those S-400 missile defense system, he's likely to, but they've been denied to participate in the F-35 program, which most of the NATO member states are taking part in. So once again, if you look at it from all different, you have to look at it also from the Mediterranean, threats coming from the south, threats coming from the southeast, threats coming from the north of Europe, and threats coming from the eastern flanks. There's numerous threats, and the 29 member states are not going to always agree on everything. Remember, NATO was founded in the late 1940s as all common united against one threat. That was communism. When communism ended by the late 80s, early 90s,
so is it still relevant?
The national interest that the countries had will begin to... Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
If I could just ask you, because there are a lot of questions about whether NATO is still relevant, because as you say, it was formed to combat the threat of Soviet communism. That threat simply doesn't exist anymore. You had President Macron say we need to be pivoting towards the south, and the threat coming from the Sahel and from Islamist jihadism. We've got President Trump saying, why should I be paying to keep Europe safe? You know, there are some very big existential questions hanging over NATO and its relevance today, aren't there?
That's the points I made, is that there are very serious, significant differences. But what maintains the unity is the realization that the union of the 29 member states, in confronting all those threats you mentioned, one thing is important, is unity amongst all of them in confronting that, because eventually, if the union were to break up, and the individual states were to be confronting those threats on their own, they'd be a far weaker individually as opposed to being and operating collectively. So this is an ongoing discussion. Once communism ends by the early 90s, NATO begins to evolve. It starts to extend in areas such as Afghanistan, Eastern Africa, again, the fight against piracy. But it was basically the invasion of Crimea, the takeover of Crimea by Russia in 2014, which begins, obviously, the mission begins to come back towards Europe again, realizing that it's on its immediate frontiers, there are actually big threats. On the eastern flank and also from the northern flank. You have issues regarding the Arctic also. There's numerous issues. Everything you mentioned, plus more. But the question, the bottom line is this. Will they be confronting these challenges? Will they do so better collectively or individually? And my reply is better collectively, but you're going to have to be putting up with 29 countries, with 29 different national interests, and it's going to take a lot of skillful and responsible management and a lot of leadership. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. In recent times, rhetorically, it hasn't been helping that they've been trading personal insults. But I think the NATO as an organization has lasted 70 years. And as an organization, it will outlast the current leaders to continue into the future.
All right, Marco Vicenzino, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you very much.
Thank you.